The locker room insult. The locker room was always loud after practice. The sound of shoulder pads clashing against the metal benches, the scraping of cleats on the floor, the chatter of teammates joking, laughing, or sometimes arguing. It was supposed to be a place of brotherhood, where everyone was equal once they put on the same jersey. But for one young player, it did not always feel that way. He was quiet most of the time, the kind of person who let his work on the field do the talking. He had broad shoulders, a calm face, and eyes that always seemed to be studying everything around him. He was not the type to get into arguments or show off. He came to practice, he trained harder than anyone else, and then he left. But that quietness made him a target. Some of the louder players, the ones who felt threatened by anyone different, saw silence as weakness. And when they looked at him, they saw more than just a teammate. They saw his skin, and to them, that was enough reason to push him down. One evening, after a rough practice, the noise in the locker room grew sharper. Two teammates sat across from him, still in their padded uniforms. They had been laughing among themselves, whispering, before one of them raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Why are you even here, man?" one of them said with a smirk. "This is not your place. Go back to where you came from." The other laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, go back to Africa. You don't belong here." The words hit the air like stones, sharp and cruel. Some teammates shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Others looked away, pretending not to hear. Silence can sometimes cut deeper than laughter. The young player did not move. His eyes lowered for a moment, not out of shame but out of control. He had learned long ago that anger was a fire that, once lit, could burn everything around it. And he was not about to give them that victory. He simply tightened his hands into fists, then slowly relaxed them. Inside, though, a storm raged. He was tired of being seen only for the color of his skin. He was tired of being treated as if he were less than them, but at the same time, he remembered the words that had been carved into his mind since childhood. Words from the man who had raised him, the man who had shaped him, his grandfather. "Do not let small men pull you into small fights," his grandfather used to say. "You carry a name, you carry a bloodline. Walk with it. Do not crawl with them." He sat quietly in the locker room, breathing deeply as the bullies continued to laugh. They expected him to explode, to lash out, to lose control, but he did not give them that. His silence was not weakness. It was strength. Later that night, he left the stadium alone. The air outside was cool, the sky dark. He walked home slowly, the words still echoing in his ears. Yet with every step he thought of his grandfather. He thought of the man who had taught him what true power looked like. Not the kind that comes from fists or cruel words, but the kind that comes from standing tall when the world tries to break you. As he pushed open the door to his small apartment, the memories came back like an old film playing in his head. His grandfather's voice, deep and steady, guiding him through childhood. His grandfather's hands, rough with age, resting firmly on his shoulders as he taught him to look a man in the eyes and never flinch. The locker room insult was not the first time he had faced such cruelty, and it would not be the last. But this time he was older, stronger, more prepared. He knew how to turn pain into fuel. And soon those who mocked him would learn that silence was not weakness. It was the beginning of something far more powerful, for in his blood ran the legacy of a man who had once walked among giants, a man whose reputation was built on fear and respect. The young player was not a fighter in the streets, nor was he a man who chased trouble. But he carried something that most people could never see, a history of survival, of discipline, of power hidden beneath calm eyes, and though his teammates had no idea, the blood of a Mafia enforcer ran through his veins. That night, as he sat by the window and looked out at the city lights, he made himself a promise. He would not let their words define him. He would not let hate win. He would rise not by shouting back, not by fighting in anger, but by proving with every step, every practice, every game that he belonged, not because he needed their approval, but because greatness was already inside him. Tomorrow would be another day of practice. Tomorrow the bullies would likely laugh again. But tomorrow he would be stronger than today, because he carried more than just a jersey on his back. He carried a legacy that could not be broken, and soon they would see it. He had always known that his childhood was different from the other kids around him. While his friends played outside late into the night, he had a strict routine that never bent no matter how much he wanted to. His grandfather was the one who created that routine, and he enforced it with the kind of discipline that could not be ignored. Every morning, before the sun even rose, the boy would hear the slow creak of his grandfather's footsteps on the wooden floor, followed by the sharp knock on his door. "Up, the world does not wait for you," his grandfather would say in a voice that was firm but never cruel. The boy would drag himself out of bed, his body still heavy with sleep, but he knew better than to complain. Complaining was weakness, and weakness had no place in the house his grandfather ruled. The mornings began with push-ups, sit-ups, and running. His grandfather never gave him an explanation at first, never told him why this was so important. He simply ordered, and the boy obeyed. At times, the boy thought it was unfair. Why should he have to work so hard when other kids were allowed to sleep in, to laugh freely, to enjoy an easier life? Yet as he grew, he began to notice something. His body became stronger, his breathing steadier, his will sharper. While other kids stumbled in exhaustion during gym class, he stood tall. While others grew tired of carrying heavy bags home, he moved as if weight was nothing to him. His grandfather's strict training was building something invisible, an armor of both body and mind. But it was not just about physical strength. His grandfather would sit him down at night after long days and tell him stories. They were not fairy tales or children's tales, but sharp lessons woven into narratives that the boy never fully understood until he got older. His grandfather would lean back in his chair, the shadows of the dim lamp falling across his face, and say, "Respect is not given. Respect is taken, and once it is yours, you never let it go. But you do not take it with fists. You take it by showing the world you cannot be broken." The boy would nod even when he did not fully understand, because he could see the weight behind his grandfather's eyes. Sometimes, the old man's hands would tremble slightly as he poured himself tea. The boy would notice scars running across his arms and knuckles, deep lines carved into his skin that spoke of a violent past. He was curious, but he never dared to ask directly. He only listened, and in pieces he began to understand. His grandfather had lived a life filled with shadows, a life where strength had meant survival, where silence had meant protection, and where respect had been the difference between life and death. Though he never revealed all the details, the boy knew enough to recognize that his grandfather was not an ordinary man. This upbringing gave the boy something most children never had, a foundation built on discipline and inner toughness. When others faced insults, they broke. When he faced them, he absorbed them, turning the pain into fuel. His grandfather's voice was always in his head during those moments. Never give them the satisfaction of seeing you fall. They will try to push you down because they are afraid of what you can become. Stand taller each time. As he entered his teenage years, the lessons grew harder. His grandfather demanded more. Longer runs, heavier lifting, sharper focus in school. There were times when the boy hated it, when he wished he could be free to live like everyone else. But deep inside, he knew his grandfather was preparing him for something bigger. There was always a sense that the world outside their home was waiting with challenges, and only discipline could prepare him to face them. He remembered one particular night clearly. He had come home from school after a rough day, his clothes stained, his eyes red from holding back tears. A group of boys had pushed him around, mocking him, calling him names he did not repeat when he walked into the house. His grandfather took one look at him and did not ask what happened. Instead, he sat him down, poured him a glass of water, and said, "You think this is the last time the world will try to hurt you? No, they will do it again and again, but you will not meet them with anger. You will meet them with greatness. You will not fight them with your fists. You will fight them with your life. Every insult is a seed. You will turn it into growth." Those words stayed with him. That night, instead of crying, he went for a run through the dark streets. His legs burned, his chest ached, but each step felt like he was leaving weakness behind. By the time he returned home, sweaty and exhausted, he had made a promise to himself. He would never let the cruelty of others define him. As the years passed, his grandfather grew older, his once strong body slowing down. But his presence never faded. Even when he could not walk as fast, his eyes burned with the same fire. He reminded the boy constantly that the strength of a man was not measured by his size or the noise he made, but by the way he carried himself when the world tried to break him. "You carry my blood," he would say, tapping the boy's chest. "You carry the blood of men who stood tall in the face of storms. Do not forget that." It was only later, much later, that the boy began to truly understand what those words meant. For now, as he grew into a young man, he simply lived by them. He kept his head down in school, trained harder in sports, and stayed away from trouble. He did not chase fights, but he did not run from challenges. His discipline, his silence, his strength, they all came from the lessons drilled into him since childhood. In the quiet moments, he sometimes wished he could thank his grandfather in a way that showed the depth of his gratitude. But the old man never wanted thanks. He only wanted to see the boy grow into someone unbreakable, someone who could carry the weight of a legacy and turn it into something brighter. Now, as he faced the insults in the locker room years later, he knew those bullies had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw only a quiet teammate, someone they thought could be pushed aside. But what they could not see was the childhood of discipline that had forged him, the nights of sweat and pain that had shaped him, and the blood of a man who had once been feared in ways they could never imagine. He did not need to raise his voice to answer them. His life would answer for him. He never asked for it, but the truth of his family name followed him everywhere like a shadow. Most people thought he was just another kid trying to prove himself in school, on the field, and in life. But deep inside, he carried a story that most of his teammates, teachers, and even friends would never understand. His grandfather had lived a life hidden between silence and whispers, and from that life came lessons, warnings, and strength that flowed through the boy's veins like a second heartbeat. The boy's mother had once told him that his grandfather was not an ordinary man. She never went into details, and she often avoided his questions, but every now and then, when her guard was down, she would let a hint slip. "Your grandfather," she once said softly, "was not a man people crossed. He was someone you respected, whether you wanted to or not." At the time, the boy did not fully understand what she meant. Respect to him was about being kind, working hard, and helping others. But the look in her eyes told him that his grandfather's respect had been something heavier, something earned through fire and fear. One night, when he was about 12, curiosity pushed him further. He asked his grandfather directly, "Why do people say you were feared?" His grandfather paused, his cup of tea resting in his hand, the steam curling between them. He looked at the boy for a long time before answering, his voice calm but edged with memory. "I lived a life where weakness was not allowed. A life where men tested you every day, and if you bent once, you were finished. I survived because I learned how to stand straight, even when everything tried to break me. That is the blood you carry. Not the violence, not the anger. You carry the strength." Those words stayed with him, like a fire lit inside. He began to see his training, his discipline, his silence in a new light. It was not just about being strong physically. It was about carrying something greater, something invisible, something powerful enough to outlast insults, laughter, and even hatred. His grandfather had passed on more than routines. He had passed on a bloodline that had been tested in storms and had refused to break. At school, when the teasing grew sharper, the boy would close his eyes at night and hear his grandfather's voice reminding him, "Strength is not shown by how loud you shout. Strength is shown by how you rise after being pushed down." And so he rose. Again and again he rose. On the field, when the other players mocked him or tried to push him around during practice, he never responded with fists. Instead, he let his legs run harder, his arms push stronger, his focus grow sharper. Every cruel word became fuel. Every shove became a reason to fight harder for the ball. Coaches started to notice that he never quit, never slowed, and never lost control. He was becoming a force, and it was not because he wanted to prove the bullies wrong. It was because he wanted to honor the legacy that had been handed to him. Late at night, when the streets outside grew quiet, he sometimes caught his grandfather staring out the window, lost in thought. He never disturbed him, but he always wondered what memories lived in that silence. Maybe old battles, maybe regrets, maybe victories too dark to share. But whatever they were, they had shaped the man who raised him. And now, those same memories shaped him as well, even if only through the lessons they left behind. His grandfather often said, "The world will try to write your story for you, but you must hold the pen. Do not let them decide who you are." The boy repeated those words to himself every time the bullies laughed. He refused to let their words write his story. Instead, He chose to write it with his effort, his sweat, and his resilience. As he grew older, the whispers about his grandfather became clearer. People in the neighborhood would sometimes lower their voices when they mentioned him. Older men, who seemed tough to everyone else, nodded respectfully whenever they crossed paths with him. It was strange, almost surreal, to see how much weight his grandfather's presence carried. To others, he was a man who once commanded respect through power. To the boy, he was simply the man who woke him up before dawn, who corrected his posture when he ran, who reminded him never to let hatred turn him bitter. And yet there was no denying it. The bloodline mattered. It was not about fame, not about power, not even about fear. It was about resilience, about a will that refused to bend. That was the true inheritance his grandfather had given him. Not money, not luxury, not an easy path, but something far more valuable. The ability to keep going no matter what stood in his way. This inheritance shaped how he saw the world. He began to understand that bullies were loud because they were afraid of silence. They tried to push him down because deep inside, they feared what he might become if he stood tall. And so he stood. Not with pride that shouted, but with pride that breathed quietly inside him. When he thought about the future, he did not see revenge or triumph over his teammates. He saw something bigger. He saw himself becoming a man who could carry forward his grandfather's lessons into every space he entered. A man who could show that respect, dignity, and strength could overcome cruelty and hate. The bloodline of strength was not about fists or fear. It was about rising. It was about walking into the storm and still keeping your head high. It was about proving that no insult, no shove, no laughter could erase the truth of who you are. That was what his grandfather had given him, and that was what he promised to carry for the rest of his life. The bullies had no idea. They only saw a quiet boy. But inside him lived generations of endurance. Inside him lived a legacy of men who had been tested by fire. Inside him lived the bloodline of strength, and it would one day change everything. The next few weeks unfolded slowly, but every day seemed to test him more than the last. The bullies never stopped their remarks. They found new ways to laugh, new words to throw, and new tricks to try to shake his confidence. In the locker room, they smirked when he walked by. On the practice field, they shoved a little harder when the coach was not looking. They thought their voices carried power, but what they never realized was that each insult was being absorbed like fuel inside him. Every shove, every laugh, every sneer only made his steps sharper, his focus stronger, and his resolve harder. He was not there to fight them. He was there to rise above them, and in doing so, he would one day show them the difference between cruelty and greatness. During drills, he kept his eyes forward. When they whispered behind him, he pretended not to hear. When they mocked him after a missed catch, he tightened his jaw and went back into the line. What no one knew was that inside, he was repeating his grandfather's words. Do not meet them with anger. Meet them with greatness. That sentence became his shield. It turned moments of frustration into lessons. Instead of breaking down, he built himself up piece by piece. At times, though, it was not easy. There were nights when he returned home and felt the weight of loneliness pressing down. He would sit on the edge of his bed, his hands pressed against his face, wondering why he had to carry such a heavy burden. Why him? Why did others get to walk freely while he had to constantly defend his right to simply exist? But then he would remember the look in his grandfather's eyes whenever he spoke of strength. He would remind himself that storms were not punishments but tests. He was being sharpened just as steel is sharpened by fire. His performance on the field began to reflect this change. At first, his coaches noticed he was running faster, reacting quicker, and holding his ground in ways he had not before. He was no longer just another player in practice. He was becoming someone who demanded attention without even trying to. And it was not because he shouted or bragged. It was because his work spoke louder than anything else. Teammates who once overlooked him started to notice his consistency. They started to see that when others got tired, he kept going. When others lost focus, he stayed sharp. The bullies noticed too, though they would never admit it. Their jokes grew louder, their shoves stronger, as if trying to cover their growing unease. Deep down, they could sense it. The quiet boy they thought they could break was not bending. Instead, he was rising, and every day he rose, their control slipped a little more. One afternoon after practice, a moment came that tested him more than any insult before. The team had been running scrimmages, and he had played exceptionally well, catching passes and holding his ground. The coach even praised him in front of everyone, a rare gesture that made the Bullies' smirks falter for just a second. As they returned to the locker room, one of the Bullies slammed into him deliberately, knocking the gear out of his hands. The laughter that followed was sharp, and for a brief second anger flared in his chest. He could have lashed out. He could have thrown a punch that would have silenced the laughter instantly. But he did not. He crouched down, picked up his gear calmly, and walked on without a word. To anyone watching, it looked like he had backed down. But inside, he knew he had won. He had not given them what they wanted. He had not lowered himself to their level. He carried himself with quiet dignity, and in that dignity was power. Later that night, he reflected on the moment. He thought about how easy it would have been to fight, to answer insult with anger. But his grandfather's teachings echoed again. Strength was not about fists, it was about character. By holding back, he had proved something greater. He was not controlled by hate. He was controlled by his own will. The following practices only deepened his determination. He trained harder, not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to be better. Every sprint, every lift, every drill became a chance to push past the limits others set for him. And with each day, he grew into someone the Bullies could not understand. They saw only a quiet face, but they could not see the storm of discipline and legacy inside him. What they also did not see was how others began to shift. A few teammates who had once stayed silent during the bullying started to look at him differently. Some even offered quiet nods after good plays, a small but powerful gesture of respect. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. His silence was no longer seen as weakness. It was becoming something others could feel, an unshakable strength that did not need to be spoken. The Bullies still laughed, but their laughter began to sound forced. Deep inside, they were beginning to realize that they were not dealing with just another boy. They were dealing with someone who carried something bigger, someone who could not be broken by their cruelty. They had no idea what blood ran in his veins, what lessons had been carved into him since childhood, or what kind of fire burned quietly inside him. The boy knew his moment would come. He did not know when or how, but he trusted that life always gave you a chance to prove yourself. Until then, he would continue to face the Bullies the only way he knew how, not with words, not with fists, but with unshakable strength, steady work, and the legacy of a man who had taught him that true power lived in silence. And when that moment came, he would not just face them. He would rise so high that their laughter would be drowned out by the sound of his greatness. The season had been building toward this moment, though no one could have predicted how important it would become. The air was sharp with anticipation as the team prepared for one of the most crucial games of the year. The bleachers were packed with fans, parents, and classmates. The floodlights glowed against the evening sky, illuminating the field in a way that made every breath feel heavier, every movement more meaningful. For him, this was more than just another game. This was the day he would finally show everyone who he was, not with words but with action. He stood on the sidelines during warm-ups, his helmet tucked under his arm, eyes steady on the field. Around him, teammates laughed, shouted, and clapped one another on the back, but he stayed quiet, focused. The Bullies were there too, stretching nearby, sneering occasionally in his direction as though to remind him that their eyes were still on him. But this time their stares did not shake him. He had been preparing for this moment far longer than they realized. Years of discipline, nights of training, and lessons passed down by his grandfather had built him for this very stage. When the whistle blew and the game began, the energy was electric. The opposing team was strong, fast, and aggressive. They scored quickly, sending waves of cheers from their side of the stadium. His team stumbled at first, nerves getting the better of them, mistakes piling up. The Bullies barked orders and pointed fingers, blaming others when plays broke down. But he remained calm. He listened to the coach, he focused on the ball, and he waited. Then came his chance. Midway through the second quarter, the quarterback looked desperate, boxed in by defenders. At the last second, he spotted him running across the field. The ball flew in his direction, high and fast, the kind of pass that could make or break a play. Time seemed to slow as he stretched his arms, leaping higher than anyone expected. The ball landed firmly in his hands, and before the defenders could react, he was sprinting down the sideline, legs pumping like pistons. The crowd erupted as he crossed into the end zone, scoring his first touchdown of the season. It was not just a score, it was a statement. His teammates, even the ones who had doubted him, slapped his helmet and shouted his name. The coaches beamed with pride, but what struck him most was the silence of the bullies. For the first time, they had nothing to say. The game pressed on, and he did not slow down. Every time the ball came near him, he gave everything. He caught passes under pressure, pushed through tackles, and never once let fatigue show. His body burned, but he remembered his grandfather's voice. Do not meet them with anger. Meet them with greatness, and so he did. With each play, he grew taller in the eyes of the crowd, the coaches, and his teammates. By the fourth quarter, he was no longer just another player on the roster. He was the one carrying the team forward, the one refusing to let defeat define them. In the final minutes, with the score tied and the crowd on edge, the coach called a play that would decide everything. The ball was coming to him again. He jogged to his position, heart pounding, sweat dripping, but his mind calm. Across the field, defenders crouched low, ready to stop him. Behind him, he could hear the voices of his teammates shouting encouragement, their earlier doubts erased by his performance. The quarterback shouted the count. The ball was snapped, and in an instant the play exploded into motion. He sprinted with all his strength, cutting sharply across the field. The defender was right on him, grabbing at his jersey, but he refused to be pulled down. The quarterback launched the ball high, arching through the night sky. For a moment it looked too far, but he pushed harder, stretching every muscle, every ounce of will, and at the last second his hands closed around the ball. He tumbled forward, landing hard, but when he stood and raised the ball, the referee's arm shot up. Touchdown. The crowd roared so loudly it shook the air. The game ended with his team on top, their victory secured by his effort. As the final whistle blew, his teammates swarmed him, lifting him onto their shoulders. For the first time, the spotlight was on him, and it was not because of his silence or the color of his skin. It was because of his greatness, earned through sweat, discipline, and resilience. In the locker room afterward, the mood was completely different from the days before. Coaches praised him openly. Teammates clapped him on the back, and even those who had once stayed quiet during the bullying now spoke his name with respect. The bullies sat in silence, their usual laughter gone, their eyes avoiding his. They had mocked him, doubted him, and tried to break him, but on the field he had answered them in a way they could never deny. He did not gloat. He did not laugh at them. He simply sat quietly, a small smile on his face, knowing that he had proven something greater than words ever could. His grandfather's lessons had carried him through the fire, and now he stood on the other side, stronger and prouder than before. That night, when he finally walked home, the echoes of the crowd still ringing in his ears, he felt a calm pride. He thought of his grandfather, of the discipline drilled into him since childhood, of the bloodline of strength he carried. He had not just played a game. He had taken a step toward becoming the man he was meant to be. And though the season was not over and challenges still lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the quiet boy they thought they could push aside. He was something more. The turning point had come, and from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. The days following that game felt different, almost as if the air itself had shifted. For so long he had been the quiet one, the target of cruel words whispered in locker rooms, the boy who had been told he did not belong. Now he was the name people spoke with pride. Students in the hallways clapped him on the shoulder. Teachers congratulated him, and even kids who had once ignored him now smiled when he passed by. On the field, his teammates no longer looked past him. They looked to him. And perhaps most surprising of all was the silence. The bullies, who had once filled every space with their jeers, had nothing to say. It was a strange silence, heavy but satisfying. They still walked into the locker room with their usual swagger, still sat in their corner, but their eyes no longer lingered on him with the same mocking smirks. They avoided his gaze altogether. When the coach called out plays and praised his effort, they stared down at their cleats. When teammates celebrated him, they forced tight smiles that could not hide their unease. They were quiet now, and that silence spoke louder than all the insults they had ever thrown. He noticed it, but he did not celebrate their defeat. That was never his goal. He had not worked to silence them. He had worked to honor his own strength. to live up to the lessons carved into him since childhood. Still, there was something deeply powerful about seeing them unable to speak. It was as though the balance of the entire team had shifted. Their voices no longer carried weight because his actions had drowned them out. At practice, the change became even clearer. The same bullies who once shoved him during drills now kept their distance. They no longer cut in front of him, no longer tried to trip him up. Instead, they trained quietly as though trying not to draw attention. Every so often, he caught one of them glancing in his direction, a flicker of something almost like respect in their eyes. They would never admit it aloud, but deep down, they knew he had proven something they could not ignore. For him, it was never about revenge. His grandfather's voice guided him through those moments. Do not let them shrink you to their size. If you rise, they will have no choice but to see you differently. And that was exactly what had happened. By refusing to bend, by answering cruelty with greatness, he had shifted the story. He was no longer their victim. He was their example. One evening, after a long practice, he sat alone in the locker room tying his shoes when one of the bullies lingered nearby. There was an awkward silence before the boy finally muttered, "Good game last week." The words were short, almost begrudging, but they carried weight. For someone who had never offered him anything but ridicule, those few words meant more than he expected. He simply nodded, offering a calm thanks in return. No anger, no gloating, just a simple acknowledgement. That was enough. It was in that moment he realized something important. Silence was not just about what bullies no longer said. It was about the space that silence created, and that quiet respect had room to grow. His dignity had forced them to look at him differently, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. Off the field, life began to mirror this transformation. In school, his confidence grew. He spoke a little more in class, raised his hand when teachers asked questions, and carried himself with a steadiness that people noticed. He was no longer shrinking into the background. He was stepping into the light, and it felt natural, as if this was who he was always meant to be. Friends began to gather around him, drawn to his calm strength. Younger players on the team started asking him for advice, wanting to know how he trained, how he kept his focus. Without even trying, he had become a leader. The bullies watched this shift quietly. They still stood together, but their power was gone. They had spent so long trying to break him, only to see him rise higher than they ever expected. Now they were left in the shadow of the greatness they had once tried to deny. And that silence, he carried it with pride, not as a reminder of their weakness, but as proof of his strength. He did not forget the pain of their words, nor did he pretend it had been easy. There were nights when he had nearly broken, days when the weight had felt unbearable, but he had endured. And that endurance had reshaped everything. His grandfather's lessons had carried him through the fire, and now he stood stronger, not just as a player, but as a young man who had found his place. Sometimes after practice, he would walk home alone and think about how far he had come. He would imagine his grandfather's voice praising him quietly, not for the touchdowns, but for the way he had handled himself, because the true victory was not on the scoreboard. The true victory was in proving that dignity could silence cruelty, that strength could outlast hate, and that greatness could grow even in the harshest soil. The silence of the bullies became more than just the absence of insults. It became a symbol, a reminder that the world can change when you refuse to bend. Their silence was his music, the sound of respect they could not speak aloud, the sound of victory without violence. And though he never needed their approval, he knew their silence meant they finally saw him for who he was. He carried himself home each night with the calm pride of someone who had faced storms and walked out unbroken. The silence followed him everywhere, not as emptiness, but as proof. And in that proof, he found strength not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. He knew now that greatness was not about silencing others. It was about rising so high that they had no choice but to fall silent on their own. The season ended with more victories, but for him, the biggest victory had already been won. He had proven himself, not only to his coaches or teammates, but to the voice inside him that had once whispered doubt. Walking through the hallways of school now felt different. The same walls that had echoed with laughter at his expense now carried quiet nods of respect when he passed by. He did not need applause, he did not need the spotlight, but the shift was clear. He no longer walked as the boy others had tried to push aside. He walked as someone who had carved his own place, steady and unshakable. The bullies remained in the background, quieter than they had ever been. They still moved through the same spaces, but their presence no longer carried the same power. The silence had stretched from one game into weeks, then months, until it was no longer awkward. It was simply natural. They had learned, though they would never say it aloud, that some people cannot be broken. Their laughter had lost its force because his strength had stripped it of meaning. But he knew his story was not just about football or about silencing bullies. It was about something bigger, something that stretched back before he was even born. It was about the legacy of his grandfather, the lessons carved into him through discipline, respect, and resilience. Each time he laced his shoes, each time he stepped on the field, he carried those lessons with him. He carried the bloodline that had endured storms far greater than insults and challenges, far heavier than football games. One evening, after the season had ended, he walked to the cemetery. The sun was low, the air cool, and the quiet streets seemed to echo his footsteps. He carried no flowers, only the weight of gratitude. As he reached his grandfather's grave, he stood for a long moment, staring at the simple stone marker. He thought of the mornings when he had been pulled from bed to run before sunrise, the nights of whispered stories and stern advice, the countless times his grandfather's voice had steadied him when the world tried to shake him. Kneeling by the grave, he whispered softly, "I did it. I remembered everything you taught me. I didn't fight with anger. I didn't let them break me. I stood tall just like you told me to." His voice trembled, but it was not from weakness. It was from the overwhelming realization that his grandfather's lessons had carried him through every storm. He stayed there for a long time, letting the silence wrap around him. In that silence, he felt his grandfather's presence, strong and steady, as if the old man was nodding in approval. He realized then that legacy is not just about blood. It is about the lessons we leave behind, the strength we pass on, the way we shape the next generation even after we are gone. His grandfather had passed down more than discipline. He had passed down resilience, dignity, and the courage to rise above cruelty. Now it was his turn to carry that forward. As he walked home, he thought about the younger kids who watched him at practice, about the ones who would face the same kind of laughter and insults he had endured. He wanted them to know that they were not defined by the voices of others. He wanted them to see that silence can be strength, that dignity can be power, and that greatness comes from refusing to bend. The next season, he returned to the field not just as a player, but as a leader. He spoke more now, offering encouragement to his teammates, pushing them to work harder, reminding them that discipline mattered as much as talent. The younger players listened closely, drawn not just to his words but to the way he lived them. They saw someone who did not give up, someone who had endured storms without losing himself. And slowly, his influence began to shape the team's culture. What had started as a battle against bullies had grown into something far greater. He had become a symbol, not because he sought it, but because he embodied it. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. Every time he stepped onto the field, every time he carried himself with quiet strength, he showed others that legacy lives on not in names or titles, but in the way we rise when life tries to break us. Years later, he would look back on these moments and understand them even more clearly. He would remember the sting of insults, the silence of teammates, the roar of the crowd, and the steady lessons of his grandfather, and he would realize that all of it, every piece, had been part of the journey. The bullies had faded into silence, but their cruelty had become the fire that shaped him. His grandfather's words had been the compass that guided him, and his own determination had been the bridge that carried him from doubt to greatness. The legacy lived on in him, and through him, it would live on in others. For he was no longer just the boy who had been bullied, no longer just the athlete who had proven himself in a game. He was a young man who carried the blood of resilience, the strength of discipline, and the unshakable truth that dignity will always outlast hate. And though the world did not know it, though his teammates never guessed it, though the bullies never understood it, the blood of a Mafia enforcer flowed quietly in his veins. Not the violence, not the fear, but the strength. The kind of strength that survives storms, that silences cruelty, that inspires generations. As he looked ahead to the future, he knew one thing with certainty. His story was not over. The legacy would live on, not just in his name, but in every life he touched, in every person he inspired to stand tall. And in every storm he overcame. The boy they once laughed at had become the man they could never forget.